All right, everybody. Well, I think everyone has had adequate time to make it into the room. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to our Demystifying ISO 27001 webinar. I'm Rick Yoakum, Managing Director of Advisory Services here at Trusted Sec. And before we really get into it, I just want to take a couple minutes to introduce who Trusted Sec is, just in case we have anyone who's sort of completely new to Trusted Sec on the line. Trusted Sec is an end-to-end cybersecurity consulting firm that really uses extraordinary talent to help our clients maintain and evolve their security programs. If you've worked with us before, you know that we like to do things just a little bit differently than some other providers. And while there's a bunch of examples of this, one of my favorite differentiators is that, as a highly skilled but super tightly knit organization, our consultants really are constantly in touch with one another throughout the day, bouncing ideas off each other, and really working to make sure that every engagement gets the sum of the best collected knowledge of all of our consultants. So even though many of our engagements formally involve working with just one or two of our consultants, you really do get the accumulated knowledge of the entire staff when in the engagements that we perform. So when you look at the various chat channels, you really can see, once you scroll through the deep meme culture that exists here, you really see the incredible value that it brings to our clients in terms of getting super expert advice on practically any cybersecurity topic, extremely quickly. And like I mentioned earlier, we are a full service cybersecurity consulting firm. So while this webinar is really focused on sort of that design tower on the far left, just know that we have services that can really help organizations, wherever they are in their security journey and really in any phase of their journey, from design all the way through responding to issues if they occur. And we work with everyone out there, from some of the largest organizations to sole proprietorships. So we typically have something for anyone. If you have needs, let us know. As one housekeeping item, please, we're going to do some questions. Please ask, Q&A, please ask them during the presentation using the Q&A function. If we can, try and avoid the chat function just so we can keep everything straight. And we'll cover a lot of those audience asked questions at the end. So with all that being said, I'll throw it to our fantastic practice lead of compliance, Chris Camejo. Take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Rick. So as Rick said, I lead the compliance practice here at Trusted Sec. I'm an ISO 27001 lead auditor, and I've been doing compliance for 16, 17 years now, so way too long, but here we are. And so we're going to be talking about ISO 27001. We've been seeing a lot of traction lately, a lot of organizations interested in 27001 that were not in the past. So it seemed like a good idea to get out there and help explain what it's all about, how it works, how it's a little bit different from some of the other compliance frameworks. And there's also been some big updates to ISO 27001 and some of its other guidelines that we'll get into in the last year. So another good reason why now is a good time to talk about it. So we'll start off with just that basic intro to ISO 27001. What's it all about? And the why behind this, why would we want to use ISO versus something else? I often see organizations try to apply information security frameworks that are completely inappropriate for their line of business. And sometimes these organizations get dragged down this road because a third party that they're looking to partner with or a customer asks them to comply with some random framework that isn't really appropriate for what they're trying to do. Commonly, I see this with things like NIST 800-53, which is supposed to only apply to federal agencies, NIST 800-171, that's only supposed to apply to government contractors working with government information, NIST CSF that was originally intended to apply to organizations doing critical infrastructure like power plants or water treatment, that kind of like big infrastructure stuff. And the problem with misapplying frameworks like this comes up when the organization is really not the type of organization the framework was intended to apply to, or they're not handling the type of information the framework was designed to protect. And that can result in difficulty determining and defining what the scope should be for the organization when like the information that the framework was designed to cover just isn't in the environment. What are you going to include in scope? You end up implementing controls that are meant to address threats that your organization is just not facing. And that's a waste of time, very inefficient. And you may also, on the flip side of that, end up with inadequate security because you're using this set of controls that you're putting in that was not really designed for the information that you do have and the type of organization that you actually are. So you're addressing somebody else's threats, not your own. ISOs are very different from that. It requires organizations to put more thought into how their information security program is going to be designed than just following one of these other frameworks like a checklist. But it provides a better result because the scope and the controls really end up tailored to each organization's specific needs and threats. And so about that different approach, most information security compliance frameworks are really just a checklist. It's a list of security controls that you have to apply to a specific type of information. So if you have payment card data, you're using PCI DSS. If you are a defense contractor, you've got that controlled unclassified information, you're using CMMC. If you have protected health information, it's HIPAA, and I could go on down this list, that these are just checklists of controls that you have to put on that information. You may have a little leeway in some of these frameworks so that you might implement controls in a slightly different way, or maybe you have some alternative or compensating controls. But for the most part, you really don't have any say in which controls have to be implemented and what they're going to apply to. The frameworks define all of that for you. The different ISO approach to this is that ISO 27001 has a set of requirements in it that your organization would follow to define your own scope, select the security controls that your organization needs to address your threats and risks, and then monitor and improve that security program over time. And that core set of processes within ISO 27001, that loop that I just described there, is called the Information Security Management System, or the ISMS. So you're going to hear me say that over and over and over again today is ISMS. That's that core loop of figuring out what controls you need, implementing them, and improving them over time. And so only the controls that your organization has determined to be necessary via that ISMS process are going to be assessed during your certification audit. So you actually don't need to go through and implement every single control in ISO 27001 the way you would with something like a PCI DSS or a CMMC.
So Chris, is it fair to say that ISO 27001 is really focused on sort of the management layer controls and not sort of the more tactical security controls that a lot of the other frameworks focus on?
Absolutely. And that's what throws a lot of organizations off, is that they're used to that checklist of technical security controls, do this, don't do that. Whereas ISO has a lot more of that kind of high level, how do we manage our overall information security program? And you see that in the standard, that when you open up the ISO 27001 document, there's two kind of major sections in there that we focus on. And one of them are these clauses, what we call the ISMS clauses, that are sections 4 through 10 in that document. Those are the actual 27001 requirements. Those are what tell you what you need to do. And it's what you're going to be audited against when you go to get certified. And those are the clauses that contain the requirements for how you manage your information security program. There are no detailed technical controls anywhere in those clauses. And so they're going to tell you how to determine what issues your organization is facing. They're going to tell you to conduct a risk assessment, have your document management processes, change control processes, and that you have to measure security performance, those kind of high-level management-y things. Annex A is the list of technical security controls. And that's what most people would more associate with a compliance framework. So technical controls like encrypting data or writing secure software, having backups, protecting against malware, monitoring your physical security. And notice, like Annex A, though, it's really like an appendix to ISO 27001. And those clauses, the ISMS clauses, that is the core of what you're trying to do here. You shouldn't be focusing on those Annex A controls when you start your ISO program.
So if 27,001 is the set of management controls really designed to, help maintain and establish and maintain an ISMS. Can I use it with a different security control framework if I didn't want to use it with the NXA controls?
Absolutely. It's very modular. We'll get into it a little bit. There's sort of like add-on modules within the ISO family that you can plug in. And you can also plug in some of those other compliance frameworks I mentioned, like PCI or HIPAA or CMMC. And we'll get into
Fantastic.
how that works.
Okay. And then if Annex A is a set of more security focused controls, I thought that was what was in ISO 27002. So what's sort of the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, so ISO 27001 is the actual standard. That is what you're going to be certified against, is the set of requirements in ISO 27001, specifically those ISMS clauses. You can think of Annex A as sort of a menu of security controls that you can put in, whereas ISO 27002 is some additional guidance that sort of helps you with some thoughtful suggestions as to how you can implement those controls. So when we get into it in a little bit, you'll see there's a ton of guidance documentation built up around ISO 27001, but there's no such thing as ISO 27002 compliance or 27002 certification. Your certification is always on 27001.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And so this is kind of my list of things that I run into, that organizations that are starting with ISO, kind of the traps that they fall into as they're trying to get to certification. And these mostly come down to misunderstanding that basic principle that 27001 is really about the management processes. So to start with, you absolutely need executive buy-in to have an effective ISO 27001 program. As you read through the standard, you'll see many of those clauses refer to, in quotes, top management. And auditors will look for evidence that your executive management is actively supporting and is involved in that ISO 27001 compliance process. Closely related to that, you have to remember information security management extends well beyond IT. So you can't just make this an IT thing. If you start considering things like the strategy, the organizational controls, people controls, physical controls, all of those are well beyond IT's traditional little area of the organization. So trying to make IT responsible for ISO 27001 compliance is going to result in frustration, because IT just doesn't have the authority to affect those sorts of changes to organization-wide processes or personnel issues or physical security that you need to have a good ISO 27001 program. I also see organizations, as Rick alluded to, kind of focusing on those Annex A security controls before they go through and define the scope and do the risk assessment and all of the other things in the ISMS clauses. If you do that and you take that controls first approach, you end up finding out that potentially the controls that you've implemented don't really align with what your scope and your risks end up being. And this is evidence to your certification auditor that you aren't really following the ISMS processes. You're just paying lip service. Yeah, sure, here's some documentation we put together, but we went off and implemented this completely separate set of controls before we even thought about those things. So you really want to focus on those ISMS clauses before you get into the technical security controls. Closely related to that, I've seen some organizations that try to just go all in and implement every single technical control from Annex A, usually because they're trying to make ISO work like one of those checklist compliance frameworks that they're used to. It was never meant to be used that way. Think of Annex A as a menu of controls to select from. Implementing every single one of those controls is a waste of resources. That's not going to be the shortcut to certification. It's just, you're going to be inefficient through the whole thing and end up going crazy as you try to implement controls that you really don't need. Similarly, some organizations may try to include their entire organization in their ISO scope. You can do it, but that would be an enormous lift for an organization that's just starting to use ISO. I usually see this approach when organizations don't want to take that time to go through the scoping process, that we're going to talk about that scoping process in detail shortly here. And so once again, that's kind of evidence for your certification auditors that you're not really bought into the ISO 27001 ISMS process. You're just sort of paying it lip service, say, yeah, everything's in scope. Let's just do this and get it over with. Your auditors will notice that, and it's going to cause you trouble down the road. So there are many guidance documents, as Rick mentioned. ISO 27002 is one of them that support ISO 27001. And a lot of organizations, when they first get into ISO, confuse those guidance documents as requirements. 27002 is absolutely the one I see this most commonly with. Anything in the ISO world that says guidance or guidelines is just there to help you understand how ISO 27001 and its controls can be implemented, not how they must be implemented. So trying to go through 27002 and use all the guidance in there as well, if we're going to implement anti-malware, it has to meet every single line in 27002. That's madness. You're going to drive yourself crazy doing that. That's not what that was intended for. Getting towards the end here, because ISO 27001 is all about process, it's not enough to just show that you've put this checklist of controls in place as you would normally do with one of those other checklist compliance frameworks. Your auditor is going to want to see evidence that those ISMS processes are followed over a period of time. So you should check with your auditor, figure out how much history will be required, but usually you want to wait at least 3 months after you've got your ISMS up and running and you're doing all the ISO things to generate the documentation, the evidence that you're actually following these processes that you've defined before you go out and have a certification audit done. And then finally, a core component of 27001 is this concept of continuous improvement. An organization that implements the 27001 controls and then just says, okay, we're done. We finished 27001. We can go do something else now. You're going to end up failing that certification audit the next time it comes around. This is all about constant monitoring and auditing and improvement to make your information security program better through this ISMS process. So think of this as something that once you start it up, it becomes part of your business as usual, not like a one and done. Okay, we've implemented it and now we're compliant. So it's going to stay the same forever.
Hey, Chris, I know a lot of our clients, as they're going through this process, they end up having some questions around, what an example of, executive evidence of executive support might look like, or an example of what continuous improvement might look like. Can you just spend a minute or two talking about that?
Yeah. So it's really woven into the whole process with the executive support, things like helping define the strategic objectives for the security program and for the ISO effort, helping provide the resources and assign the responsibilities and checking up on the results to make sure that things are actually being done and that they're effective. They're doing what the original intent was. And that also plays into the continuous improvement that top management should really be involved in that continuous improvement process as well, providing feedback on, okay, you think this can be done better. Here's the resources we have. What can we do here? So absolutely a part of that. Continuous improvement, you'll see that throughout as we get into some of the details about the ISO process. You'll see it's really kind of a loop of you go through this whole process of becoming ISO compliant, but then you've got all these feedbacks within the loop that help you with that continuous improvement over time.
That's great. And I know a lot of clients that we engage with also, they try and figure out the scheduling of all the things at once because they want to know when they're going to be done with their ISO compliance program. And I know you're going to talk about what air quotes being done really means in a little bit, but from a scheduling perspective, can you talk just a little bit about, your thoughts in terms of, scheduling the audit at the same time as, say, a readiness assessment, or scheduling, certain implementation activities in the audit at the same time?
Yeah, you definitely want to give yourself a lot of time because this is changing sometimes how your whole management process is set up around information security. It's not the kind of thing where you can just plug in some firewalls, switch them on, and be compliant in a week or two. So you want to plan for potentially months to get your ISMS stood up, do your risk assessments, get all that in place, and then a few more months to go through and get the controls that you need to install, the more traditional technical controls, and then the time to generate that evidence to show it's running. So generally, like start to finish, you're looking at like 6 to 9 months minimum from like the day you start ISO to the day that you could possibly be ready for a certification audit. Generally, it's longer than that. So you don't want to be kind of penciling in dates in Sharpie with your compliance audit when you're just first starting your ISO journey, because there's a whole lot of detours you may end up taking along the way.
Got it.
Right. And so this is a look at the big picture, the whole ISO family here, or at least the 27,000 family. And so if you're starting off with 27,001, we've got two core documents shown up in the top left corner here that you really need to take a look at. 27,000 is basically a high-level overview of what all the rest of this is all about within the 27,000 family. But the key thing I like from that document, I still use it as a reference all the time, is the glossary. ISO uses certain words and phrases in very specific ways. And if you don't have that glossary handy, you're going to be reading through 27,001 or some of these guidance documents, and you're going to be wondering, like, what the heck do they mean by nonconformity or top management? Or 27,000 explains all that. So grab that core document to have that glossary. And then, of course, the other core document is 27,001 itself. That gives you all those ISMS clauses, and it gives you that list of controls in Annex A. So that document is what you will be certified against. So, of course, you need to have that. And then you'll find as you go through 27,001, some of the requirements, the control definitions, they can be pretty vague or very kind of, they're short with their words sometimes. And that can make them hard to understand for somebody new to 27,001 or ISO in general. And so that's where all these other guidance documents come in to help you understand the 27,001 requirements and controls. These documents are your friends as you try to go through this process. You don't want to just look at them and say, wow, there's a lot of words in here. This is scary. Like, the words are in there because they're going to help you understand what ISO 27001 is trying to say. And I said it already. I'm going to say it again. Remember, guidance and guidelines are just suggestions. They do not impose any new requirements beyond what's in 27001 itself. So two of the most important guidance documents shown in the top center here are ISO 27003, and this expands on those core ISMS clauses in 27001, explaining more about that management system and how that should work. And then 27,002, as Rick mentioned earlier, that expands on each of those controls in the list in Annex A and gives you a lot more detail about how you can implement them, things to think about as you're implementing them. So those are the next two top of my list. Most organizations that have done ISO before should pick both of those up. Other guidance documents shown to the right of that go even deeper. So if you need some specific walkthroughs of how to perform certain processes or more explanation on some of the core concepts of the ISMS, those are the documents you want. Great example there is ISO 27005. Which gives you a step-by-step process for performing a risk assessment that aligns with the 27001 requirements. So if you've never really done a risk assessment before, you don't know how to do it, 27005 is a great resource. ISO also publishes some add-ons to 27001 and 2 that can be useful. So in the bottom right, you can see that there's some add-ons there for privacy controls, cloud security controls. Put those both together, get some cloud privacy controls, some health information guidelines. And so these really kind of like add to that menu of security controls in Annex A and the guidance that's in 27002 to help you expand your ISMS to cover more different types of security beyond the core functions there. As you look through, you might see some of these documents that are not numbered 27,000. So kind of on the right side there, you'll see ISO 31000 and 19011. And that's because ISO it's more than just information security. They've got standards on many different things. And so they rely on some of their other frameworks here where they have like 31,000 is generic risk management guidance. And they've built on that to create 27005, which is specific to information security risk management. And so there's all sorts of references out there. These are threads that you can pull as far as you need to really understand what they're trying to tell you and get that help that you need.
So it sounds like, Chris, all those guidelines documents, they're really more reference material than things that should be read or implemented cover to cover. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. If I'm going through, and again, I've been doing this for a long time, but they just updated Annex A last year. So if I'm going through and I read a control in Annex A and I say, what do they mean by this? I pull up 27002 and it tells me exactly what they meant by it.
Perfect.
And so now we'll get into the actual, how are we going to implement ISO 27001? This is mostly kind of a step-by-step walkthrough of the process. And step one is, even before you define your scope, to determine what the organization is trying to accomplish and what sort of issues your organization faces. And this context information is going to be used when you're determining the scope, when you're determining your risks, and when you're establishing information security objectives, all other things that you have to do as part of ISO. And ISO divides this up into two different parts, the issues facing your organization and the requirements of the interested parties. And so the issues are things that might affect how we would implement the ISMS or interfere with our ability to implement that ISMS. The interested parties are the people that are going to be part of our ISMS process or otherwise affected by it. And those people may have requirements that can also affect how the ISMS will be implemented. There's often some overlap between the issues and the requirements of those interested parties. For example, like an interested party may want the ISMS to help them comply with a certain legal obligation for information security where they have to protect data. But that legal obligation itself could be a compliance issue that the organization as a whole faces that you're going to list as one of your external issues, that our external issue is that we have to comply with this law or this regulation. And so when thinking about these issues, the interested parties, you can also divide them up into external and internal issues and parties. And usually the way to think about that is your organization has at least some control over internal issues. These can be things like the resources that you're going to dedicate to this, the skills and experience that you have within your organization, whereas external issues are things that your organization really doesn't have control over. So that legal requirement that's been put upon you by the government, you can't just go and change that. Or the requirements that contractual requirements that your partners or customers are putting on you. And so that's a good way of thinking about this, is dividing it up by what do we have control over that we can change and what don't we have control over, so that you can help put all that context in context. And so that brings us to defining the actual scope of what ISO 27001 will apply to within your organization. And ISO 27001 requires us to use those issues and requirements that we just talked about as you determine that scope. Business units that are included in your scope may rely on other parts of your organization or other third parties to support information security. So the ways that different parts of your organization or your organization and other third parties interface with each other will kind of factor into this scope definition, where you need to figure out, like, where are we going to draw that line of what's in scope and out of scope, and how are we going to handle that interface between our organization and the third party, or between our part of the organization that's in scope and the other parts of the organization that we want to keep out of scope. So ISO calls that interfaces and dependencies. When you define that scope, we should think about it at kind of three levels: the organizational level, the technology level, and the physical level. And so an organization scope could be an entire business unit, or maybe a specific process or a service. Maybe your customer service platform would be the service that you decide that you want to have ISO compliant and certified. The technology scope will usually cover like the networks, the systems, and the information that support that organizational scope. And then your physical scope, that could be as broad as an entire region or specific facilities or certain rooms within a facility that support those business processes, the organizational scope and the technology scopes. So generally, an organization will start by choosing a preliminary scope that focuses on one of these categories. Maybe you want to say all sensitive customer information, or the engineering department, or our software as a service platform, or our research and development facility. And that's your preliminary scope. That's where you're starting from based on what you're trying to accomplish here. With that preliminary scope in mind, you start mapping out those other scope categories. So what systems, facilities, and processes handle that sensitive customer information, or what systems and rooms does the engineering department use? And so as you document that to get to your final scope, you have to describe what you're going to include or exclude in the scope. Like, I should be able to walk in as an auditor, read this document, and just understand, okay, here's definitively whether or not this thing is in scope. The boundaries of that scope, so where those edges are. Typically, a logical boundary would be like a network firewall that's isolating your systems and networks that are in scope from the things that are out of scope. Physical boundary could be like the exterior of a facility, or it could be certain doors within the facility, like maybe a data center door, if just the inside of the data center is going to be inside the scope. And then going back to those interfaces and dependencies, those interfaces between what's in scope and out of scope and those other functions that they rely on should be documented as part of your scope as well. And so you write that all up. Now you've got your ISO scope that everything else will flow from.
So Chris, sorry, before we get in there, there's a couple questions that are just too tailored to your prior slide for me to go past them. Edwin noted that he's seen sort of the scoping processes for an ISMS sometimes get very specific. So for instance, just targeting one specific system without really addressing any of the real risks for that system, because it could be attacked from any logically adjacent or physically adjacent system. But that limiting of scope still allows an organization to get the certificate effectively. And so his question really is, when you see that happen, is there really any value in that case?
Yeah, if it is, there is absolutely can be scoped way too narrow. And that's a great example of it when you've scoped it down to one system and completely ignored everything around it. Theoretically, if you're doing your risk assessment correctly, the risk assessment should pick up the threats posed by all of those other neighboring systems, and you should be addressing that by how the system that's in scope interfaces with those other systems around it. But yeah, sometimes those things do slip through.
And then Sebastian asked, if you could just maybe spend a minute on how facility management, for instance, may or may not affect an ISMS, maybe just a couple examples there.
Yeah, so there are physical security controls within Annex A. The risk assessment is going to determine which of those controls are necessary. So if you have an organization where absolutely everything is in the cloud, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of facilities management tie into your ISMS. On the other hand, if everything is on-prem, maybe you've got a huge office with the data center as part of the same facility where people are coming and going all the time, visitors have access. You might need a lot more physical security controls to make sure that your employees and visitors that shouldn't have access to the sensitive areas don't have access, versus the people who actually do need to be in those rooms. And that's where door locks and cameras and visitor logs and escorts and security guards and all those sorts of things start to come into play, because you don't want somebody to just be able to walk into your data center, grab a bunch of hard drives and walk back out.
Fantastic. I'll have a couple more control specific scoping questions, but we'll let you do the next slide first.
All right. So a few tips for scoping. Don't make that scope overly broad. I mentioned it earlier, trying to include your entire organization in scope that's going to take you to a bad place. It's going to make everything take much, much longer. So I would say start with a small scope, maybe not as small as a single server, but start with a smallish scope that accomplishes your objectives for why you're doing ISO in the first place, and add to it over time, because ISO is all about continuous improvement. So expanding your scope over time is absolutely a part of that continuous improvement process. When you're trying to determine your scope, consider what will help you meet those objectives. So for example, if you're pursuing 27001 compliance because you've got business partners asking you to protect their data, can you limit your ISO scope to just the systems, processes, and facilities that handle that business partner's data? That's a great place to start with that preliminary scope. Also consider those issues and requirements that you determined in the context phase. So if there's something that you're considering including in the scope that conflicts with those issues or requirements that you defined earlier, maybe you should leave it out of the scope until you can address those issues. And then you should also consider whether that thing that you want to include in the scope is mature enough. So if you've got something that is an absolute mess, it's never really had solid formal information security processes around it, trying to just dump that into the ISO scope could make it take longer to get certified. If you can narrow your scope, you can keep that thing out of scope, get your certification on the narrower scope, and then work on that other thing and add it to the scope over time when it becomes ready. And finally, I mentioned it before, but ISO 27001 is about information security. IT is only a part of that. So make sure your scope includes those business processes, the people, the physical environments, in addition to those technical server workstation type systems that IT runs. Think big picture on all of these things. If your scope is just this server over here, that's way too narrow. Who's using that server? Where's that server located? What's the server being used for? What can it affect? Those are the kinds of questions you should be asking. Just keep thinking through what you're trying to secure and what other things around it can affect its security. And that may be, the thing you're trying to secure might be a particular type of information, in which case you'll consider the IT systems and networks that process it, the physical locations where it's processed in both electronic and hard copy form. It's often overlooked. People just tend to think about this as an electronic computer thing, but information is information. If it's a printout, it's still stealable. It's still a potential risk. And you can also define that scope based on a particular process. So like an IT failure can affect the process, but so can an organizational failure or physical failure. If your data center catches on fire, that's just as bad as the server crashing. So you have to consider all of those big picture things as part of the security picture.
So Chris, one of our attendees had asked, with respect to sort of third parties, when they're thinking about the risk that a third party might pose to you, how much confidence does that third party having an ISO certificate give you with respect to their risk in relation to your organization?
Yep.
And this is kind of a two-parter. Should they be looked at with less scrutiny if they have an ISO certificate? Or if I'm looking at that third party, can I maybe scope certain controls out of my review if they are ISO certified? So you want to cover that one really quickly?
Yeah, so the key thing there is what's their scope? So if they have that ultra narrow scope where their ISO certificate covers this one server over in a dusty corner that doesn't actually do anything, then no, their certificate's not really worth much of anything to you if that's not the system that you care about. If you're sending that organization data that they're putting on a completely different system than the one that's in scope for ISO, then effectively their ISO certificate is useless to you. So you definitely want to check that scope, make sure that the thing that they've certified is realistically the thing that you care about. If they have done that, if their scope, the certificate, everything looks good and aligns with what you would expect, then it doesn't necessarily change how you would do your own ISO program. You wouldn't just write off entire controls because of that. It's something that you would look at as part of your risk management process, which we're about to get into in a moment here, where you would say, okay, well, because they're doing these things, these risks are a little bit lower. So maybe we don't need these particular controls. A control that you would have on that interface between you and the third party may no longer be necessary because that risk is reduced. So it's just another factor that goes into your risk management process.
Fantastic. And I will just note that Adrian also had a scope related question, but I think you're going to cover it when we get to statements of applicability. So okay. Carry on, sir.
All right. So once we've determined our scope, now we have to figure out how we're going to implement our ISMS. Much like the scope, ISO tells us that we have to consider those context issues and personal requirements that we identified earlier. And we also need to consider what sort of opportunities the ISMS presents. Like how can we use this ISMS to do better things within our organization, and any risks that can prevent that ISMS from achieving our intended outcomes for it. And also any risks that the ISMS may cause undesired side effects because you don't want your security interfering with your normal business processes. And so this is kind of your first step into risk in the ISO world, is figuring out what potential risks are posed to the ISMS, and what potential risks does the ISMS itself pose. And we also consider what we are going to do to achieve the continual improvement as part of that, the ISMS process at this phase. And so consider all these things, and you end up writing up an implementation plan that's going to describe, here's the actions that we're going to take to address those risks and the opportunities we've identified, how we're going to implement those actions, and how we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of those actions once we've taken them. And so this is really your first taste of two concepts that run throughout ISO 27001, documenting everything and that continuous improvement, because by determining how you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of those actions that you're planning to take, you're setting the stage to review the results later and determine what you can do to improve in the future. And so now that we've established our scope, we've planned out our ISMS, here comes the big risk management process that's going to tell us which controls from Annex A that we actually need to implement. And so the first step is to determine your criteria for performing a risk assessment. And this criteria is basically when and how we're going to perform the risk assessment, including like how we're going to score risks and prioritize risks and determine whether or not we want to accept certain risks. And so those should just be objective criteria for here's how we're going to do this every time. And if you're already doing some sort of risk assessment, maybe not an information security risk assessment, but you have a higher level kind of organizational risk assessment that already has criteria established, it's absolutely a good idea to try to align your information security risk assessment criteria with any other risk assessments that you're already doing within your organization so that you can integrate those results. Typically, most organizations will have kind of up at the C level, a big risk assessment where information security is a single line item. This is a risk assessment where every line item is a specific information security risk. And a key piece of that criteria is defining the methodology that you're going to use for the risk assessment. I mentioned ISO 27005 earlier that provides a detailed methodology that you can use, but totally not required. NIST 800-30 is another popular risk assessment methodology that some organizations that work in the federal space might already be familiar with, totally acceptable. And those methodologies can also give you some options as how to perform them. So like ISO 27005 can give you either an event-based approach to figuring out your threats and risks or an asset-based approach. And they've got trade-offs in the effort required versus the level of detail you get. So documenting what sort of options you're using within that methodology are absolutely part of this as well. And so once you've got those criteria set up, it's time to perform the actual risk assessment. And you're really just going through applying those parameters that you established in the criteria to a list of threats to determine what level of risk does each of those threats pose based on the potential impact of the threat and the likelihood of the threat, and then prioritize each of those threats for treatment based on their risk values. And so threats would be, a hacker breaks in and ransomwares us, or it could be the data center catches on fire, or it could be somebody leaves a laptop full of sensitive data in the backseat of a taxi cab. All different things to think about and catalog as you go through this risk assessment. And that list of threats can change over time. And the likelihood or impact of a particular threat can also change over time as the information security landscape evolves. And so a core goal of this risk assessment process is repeatability, so that when you do one risk assessment and then a year or two later you do another one, you can look and say, okay, well, here's the controls we've put in. This is what effect that they've had on the risks. Here's the changes that have happened to maybe the impact or likelihood of certain threats, and here's how it affects us. And so you can get that good profile showing over time how things are getting better or worse. There's a Trusted Sec blog post linked at the bottom of this slide that goes into a lot more detail about the risk assessment process. So if this is something that's new to you, absolutely go take a look at that. That might help you out. And once you've completed that risk assessment, the next step is to figure out how you're going to treat those risks. And that doesn't always mean just implementing a control. So the goal of the risk treatment process is to get your threats and risks down below that risk acceptance threshold that you defined up in the risk criteria. Some risks you can avoid completely. So if maybe you have a database full of sensitive information and you are concerned that somebody could break in there, steal the data, but you ask around and you find out like, we really don't need all that data anymore. Well, delete the database. You've just eliminated any risk that that database posed. You don't need to put any controls around it because it's gone. So avoiding risks is an awesome way of addressing these things. Obviously, we can't go around deleting every database we have or we'd be out of business. So our remaining options are we can try to modify those risks, usually by implementing security controls. We can share risks, things like getting cybersecurity insurance or outsourcing something to another organization that can do it for us. Or we just retain the risk. We decide that, yeah, this is above our acceptance threshold, but we just can't afford to fix it because reasons. And so we've just decided that this risk is going to stay here and there's nothing we can do about it right now. And you can combine these different actions. So maybe you look at a certain threat, certain risk, and you decide that you're going to implement some controls to modify the risk and lower it a bit, but it doesn't get below your threshold. So then you implement some risk sharing with another organization, you outsource it, and that lowers your risk maybe a little bit further. But if it's still above your threshold, then you decide, okay, well, we've lowered it as much as we can with what we can do, so we're going to retain the rest of that risk. All three of those different pieces all working together. And then our final step is we need to go out and implement whatever we've just decided we're going to do to reduce those risks and treat those risks. We go do it. And so typically, again, these are the controls from the list in Annex A, but they can come from other sources as well. ISO explicitly says that you can pull security controls from other sources. So we'll get into what that means in detail in a moment here. But before we go down that road, I want to point out that I often see things that are called risk assessments that really aren't. Usually, like they don't take impact and likelihood into account, and that's kind of your litmus test of, is this a risk assessment? Is it showing you a threat with the impact and likelihood of that threat? That's what makes it a risk assessment. The usual methodology I see with the sort of faux risk assessments is it'll just be a list of security controls that are in place, yes or no. Might be from ISO, might be from another compliance framework. And if one of those controls is missing, it gets marked as a risk. You don't have anti-malware, so that's a risk. It doesn't really talk about, well, what is the potential impact to us if we get hit by malware? What is the likelihood that we get hit by malware? So because they're not considering those threats, impacts, and likelihoods, they're not real risk assessments. They're more focused on whether or not you're missing controls, whereas the risk assessment should be telling you whether or not that control is appropriate in the first place to address the threats that your organization is facing. And if you end up trying to use sort of one of these faux risk assessments as part of your ISO certification process, that's probably not going to lead to a good certification result. So just keep your eyes out for that threat, impact, likelihood approach. So the result from all that risk assessment, risk treatment stuff is a document that is another one of the core ISMS documents required by ISO called the Statement of Applicability. And this is the document your auditor will look at to determine which security controls they need to assess. A simple spreadsheet like the one we've got here on the slide is certainly a way that you can do this. Any format's acceptable, but this is about as simple as you can get. And what this document must have in it is it has to list all the controls that you decided are necessary to treat your risks, why you've decided they're necessary, and whether or not they're currently implemented. So that's the kind of the core ISO requirement for what's in here. And the other thing ISO wants you to do is any control from Annex A that you have decided not to implement, you have to justify why you're excluding it. And these excluded controls usually justified because maybe the risk that the control is trying to address is just not present in your scope. or maybe you've adequately addressed that risk using other controls. You might also exclude it because of those issues you've identified as part of your context. So maybe it's just not feasible to provide the resources to implement that control. And you can see in the example we've got here, we've excluded control 5.34 for personally identifiable information because we've said we don't have any personally identifiable information in scope. And we've also excluded control 8.11 because we've determined that other controls have adequately addressed the risks that 8.11 would address. So just examples there of what it would look like if you decide to rule some things out, which you absolutely should.
So Chris,
yeah.
Sorry, really quickly, you mentioned lack of resources potentially being a okay justification, and I totally agree. But what if it was a situation where, you go through all the risk assessment and says, hey, you need to make sure that logical security for system XYZ is really, really tight, and you're going to say, hey, we want to use multi-factor for this, but leadership just won't give me the money to implement multi-factor authentication. Can I just mark it out of scope because I don't have the resources to do it?
Yeah, so subtle difference. You wouldn't mark it out of scope per se. It's still in scope. Your risk assessment says it's something that could potentially reduce your risk. You're really just documenting that that you're retaining that risk. You have decided, or your executives have decided, that they don't want to spend the money on it, or maybe they think that multi-factor is going to be too disruptive to the users. And so that's your justification, is basically the executives told me I'm not allowed to because reasons. Which is also nice having that documentation if it comes back to haunt you later and some account gets breached and your executives are screaming about, well, why didn't you do something to prevent this? And you can say, I tried, and here's the documentation where you told me I wasn't allowed to. So that's a piece of this as well, is it's still in scope. You're just documenting the reasons why you've decided not to implement it.
Fantastic, thanks.
And so we're going to do a little bit of a detour here, talking about statements of applicability into how we can integrate other compliance frameworks with ISO. So the first thing we need to think about is scope. We said ISO lets us choose our own scope. Most other frameworks do not. So what we can do to deal with this is to basically include the scope requirements of other frameworks in our organization's context. So I'm revisiting here that slide from earlier where we talk about what has to go into our scoping process. And you can see in the top left, we're just feeding the other framework scope requirements into our external issues. So as we're developing our ISO scope, we're considering those external scope requirements from the other frameworks that will dictate how we define our ISO scope. And so now we have to figure out what to do about the controls. And the approach many organizations take is mapping. And you'll see these all over the internet, all these spreadsheets of, oh, I want to map this framework to that framework. And the table shown here is one of those. I pulled it straight out of NIST 800-171. And it shows us some of the challenges with this mapping approach. First off, ISO 27001 was updated last year, which is much more recently than NIST 800-171. So all of the ISO control numbers in this mapping are absolutely wrong. Many of the control names have changed. So now you have to go back and try to figure out, remap 800-171 to the new version of ISO 27001. And not all frameworks are updated on the same schedule, so this is often a problem. But getting into more detail, you can also see that there's a variety of different relationships between the controls. So like NIST control 3.1.4 cleanly maps to a single ISO 27001 control. Awesome, that's the best we can hope for. Some controls, like if we look at 3.1.6, just do not map. It says no direct mapping on the ISO side. So you've got a control that exists in the NIST world that just does not exist in the ISO world. You can get one-to-many relationships. So if you look at NIST control 3.1.5, you see that there's multiple ISO 27001 controls that map to that, and you have to figure out which pieces go where. You can get many to one. NIST controls 318 and 319 both map to ISO control A942. And you can, I didn't have any on here because I ran out of room, but you can also get many-to-many relationships with multiple NIST controls mapping to multiple ISO controls. This is a headache. It becomes mayhem. It's tough to sort out. And another major concern is that you lose some of the nuance when you map between frameworks, because ISO's control statements are pretty vague. They have a lot of room for interpretation because they're meant to be used by anybody, while the other frameworks tend to be a lot more specific. And so if you try to use the ISO version of a control that you've mapped across, you may find yourself failing an audit for the other framework because the other framework had a lot more nuance that just got missed. So this is an example of two different frameworks, ISO 27001 on the left, PCI DSS on the right. Two controls that really map to each other, all about data masking. And you can see just how much more specific the PCI version is, where it mentions specific parts of specific data that has to be masked, where the ISO side is just saying, yeah, make up a policy about what you want to mask and then mask those things, follow your own policy. So a great example of that lost nuance that you get when you try to do the mapping thing. So my preferred approach is direct inclusion. I mentioned earlier, ISO explicitly says that you can use controls from any source in your statement of applicability. So here we're revisiting that statement of applicability, and you can see that right in the middle there, I've got a PCI control in it, and that's cool. So now we don't have to deal with all that crazy mapping between framework stuff. We can just drop the PCI requirement right in there, and you can see underneath it that I have that data masking control from ISO that I've said is not required. We're going to exclude it from our statement of applicability because our justification says, well, the PCI requirement already covers all the data masking stuff adequately for us. Maybe if you had other data that you wanted to mask, you could include that ISO masking control and just say, well, here's the control that applies to the data that PCI cares about. Here's the separate control that applies to the other data that we care about that PCI doesn't cover. So you can mix and match this stuff any way you want to. I think this is a much easier way to do it than to try to map the control numbers across, because you maintain all of that nuance of the other frameworks. And it often lets you kind of write off some of the ISO controls by replacing them with the other frameworks controls. So back to the regularly scheduled ISO implementation. Big thing that ISO talks about is objectives. We finished that risk management process. We need to define some security objectives. And you can see this is one of our feedback loops where we've got all these different things across the top that help us decide on what our objectives are going to be. And these are just our strategic objectives for how we want our information security program to what we want it to do, what we want it to accomplish for us, how we want it to protect our data. And those objectives feed back into that risk management process that we just described, so that the next time we do our risk assessment, we're considering all of those objectives as we determine our risks. And then we use the resulting risk information to update our objectives. So there's an example of continuous improvement. And as usual, ISO wants us to write everything down. So we see those objectives turn into defined plans about what we're going to do and when and what resources it needs, who's going to be doing it, and how we're going to evaluate that it's been done successfully. This is a core part of the continuous improvement process. So ISO wants us to monitor and track the performance of the ISMS. They want us to look at the controls that we have in the statement of applicability and our security objectives and our plans. And so we need to define some data points that we're going to monitor and evaluate, and basically picking things at a high level. So we might want to track the number and severity of security incidents that are happening to get an overall picture of how our information security program is doing. We might also want to have metrics for specific controls. So maybe doing a periodic walkthrough to check compliance with our clear desk and clear screen policies, and evaluating how many misses that we're getting on that to see if our awareness program is working. And so these are typically things that are happening. We're recording and monitoring this on an ongoing basis, and then periodically taking a look at it to figure out what it's trying to tell us. Internal audits are also conducted periodically, in contrast to that more kind of continuous monitoring process. And this is not the same as your ISO certification audit. This is an internal audit that you're going to be doing in-house to make sure that you are complying with your own policies, that your policies comply with ISO. And then nonconformity is the fancy ISO term for somebody not following a policy. So whenever you find out about that, you want to have a process in place for learning from that, reacting to it, figuring out why it happened, what you need to do to prevent it from happening again, taking any necessary actions to improve on that, and reviewing the effectiveness of those actions. And so the final step in all of this is nearly everything we've talked about up to this point feeds into a management review process. All the monitoring and measuring and audits and security objectives and risk plans and all of that stuff goes into a top management review to figure out, okay, what do we need to change? Do we need to change our objectives? Are we doing great here? Maybe tweak some controls and come up with kind of the next iteration of what we're doing for ISO. And so two little things going on in the background through all of this. We mentioned the leadership involvement. ISO wants that involvement throughout the entire process. They want to see that leadership commitment, making sure that leadership is signing off on your policies and objectives and giving you the resources and communicating how important this is. So that's a key part throughout all of this. Is executive leadership shouldn't just dump this all on the head of IT and walk away from it. That will show in the audit. And then also support in the background. There should be these ongoing processes of making sure you have the resources for the ISMS, making sure people have the right skills to implement the security controls and perform security tasks, that people are aware of the ISMS and you're communicating about it and what needs to be done, and that you've got all the controls on the documents. So to that point, this is the handy cheat sheet that you might want to screenshot that shows the list of documents that ISO explicitly requires you to have as part of the ISMS. Policy and procedure type documents on the left, records and sort of evidence type documents on the right. These are all mentioned by name in ISO 27001. And certainly your organization may decide that you have other things above and beyond this list that you want to include as part of ISO. So maybe you have some existing policies and procedures that support the ISMS. You would expand on this list and include your own supporting documents in the sort of list of things that become part of this ISMS program. And so wrapping it up, just one more time, that this is a cycle. You've implemented it the first time. And so now you're going to go through, you finish that management review. So we're right back at the top again. We're going to take another look, maybe a year or 2 years down the road. Do we need to update our context? Do we need to update our scope? It's time to update our risk assessment, update our statement of applicability as a result, update our objectives and plans as a result of that, implement those changes, do another internal audit someday, do our next management review, and then start that loop all over again with all kind of your leadership and support and monitoring and measuring and controls and nonconformity corrective actions happening all throughout that cycle as part of your business as usual processes. And so that's it. You've got it up and running, and this is your new business as usual. And that's that.
Fantastic. So we'll move to it's a little bit of time for Q&A. Feel free to type them in the Q&A section of Zoom and we'll hit them. There is one, one of our attendees was hoping that you could just clarify a little more around direct inclusion versus mapping. The question really was, hey, so does direct inclusion replace mapping in this instance? And can you just talk about that one more time?
Yeah. So mapping is typically, when somebody tries to do mapping, is they're saying, okay, I have to comply with NIST. So I'm going to map the NIST controls to the ISO controls and implement the ISO versions of the controls. And so when you look at your statement of applicability in that mapping mode, your whole statement of applicability will be ISO Annex A controls. And that's where I worry about all the nuance being lost. So to contrast that with direct inclusion is that you would still potentially have all your ISO controls in your statement of applicability, but like the example I showed with the PCI requirement, you would also have requirements from one or more other frameworks in there as well. So you don't really need to do the mapping and figure out that, well, this PCI data masking requirement aligns with this ISO data masking requirement, because you just put them both in there. in your statement of applicability, and then decide like, okay, well, if the PCI one covers this, does that adequately address all of the risk that we would potentially need data masking for? Yes or no? And if no, then okay, we can use the ISO control for anything above and beyond that. So it just gets rid of that whole step of trying to figure out which controls from this framework align with which controls from that framework, and making sure you keep track of the specific little details and nuance. So it's you could potentially blend them, but I would say just forget mapping. Direct inclusion, I think, is the easier way to do it.
Okay, great. Another one of our attendees asks, what qualifications should they look for when they're selecting an auditor? And is there an ISO certification for auditors?
There is, and that's what you should look for. So like I think I mentioned at the beginning, I'm an ISO 27001 lead auditor. That is its own certification. You'll also get things like ISO 27001 lead implementer that can help as you're building out your program. So a little, similar idea, just a different focus of implementing versus auditing. So those are certainly things that you should look for. There's a little bit of the history of ISO. Is the ISO 27001 is that it was originally British Standard 7799. I think I've got the number right. It's been a few years before ISO took it over. So BSI Group is like British Standards Institute. Was originally the caretaker of what became ISO 27001. So they do a lot of training in this space, and they issue those certifications for lead auditor, lead implementer. So that's a great place to look if you're interested in getting that lead implementer training, and if you go looking for an auditor, looking for that BSI lead auditor certification. There's certainly other organizations out there that are doing the certification, but just the history there is interesting that it originally came out of the British Standards Institute.
So Chris, if I were working with an organization that sort of had multiple risks associated with it, let's pretend, one of them is, hey, there's this risk, we have some sensitive client data in our systems. And then there's another risk where we say, hey, we have some trade secret information or ways that we do things that we don't want to get out. It's very, very different risks, different kind of scopes. Maybe there's a little bit of overlap. Would I need multiple ISMSs to manage those two different risks? Would I do it with one? How would you typically suggest a client attack a situation like that?
It's ISO, so choose your own adventure. So there's pros and cons to both approaches. I would say the defining factor here is going to be, do you want to implement a single set of security controls and management processes for both of those? And I forget the security controls part. The management controls part is the more important thing here. So if you have those two separate processes, but really it's going to be the same people managing them both, you can spin up a single set of policies and procedures that cover both of them. Maybe they'll have different risks, so you'll apply different controls to each of them. But that's totally fine. It's very rare that you would have a single control that applies to absolutely everything in your scope anyways. So you could handle it all under a single certification like that. The downside being, if one of those processes slips up, you lose your certification for both processes. So another way you can handle it is to break them up separate and get your certification for each of those processes separately. Creates a little bit more overhead because now you're managing kind of two separate ISMSs on paper, even though there may be some overlap between them. You're going through two certification audits. You're going to have two separate risk assessments. You're going to have two separate internal audits and all the rest of that stuff. So yeah, breaking them out increases the overhead. But if it's the kind of thing where you've got kind of a more modular organization, maybe these are two business units that almost never talk to each other anyways, then yeah, it might make sense to go down that road versus forcing two completely different business units to work together on a single ISMS when otherwise they have nearly nothing to do with each other.
Got it. That's great. And then the last question that we have in the queue, really, I guess more of a note, but we'll pivot it into a question. From a cyber insurance kind of perspective, do you ever see relationships that clients have sort of between their ISMS or their controls, or the ability to leverage an ISMS when they're answering all these sort of cyber insurance risk questionnaires?
Yeah, so that's actually, I think, one of the reasons why we here at Trusted Sec have been getting so much interest in ISO lately is I see a lot of these questionnaires that say, answer these 300 questions about your security program, or show us an ISO 27001 certification, or show us a SOC 2 certification, which we could do a whole other webinar on SOC 2. But it worked kind of similarly to ISO, where it is very much choose your own adventure. But anyways, so we have been seeing a lot of those where the ISO certification is kind of the get out of the questionnaire free card. And so you may want to go down that road and see if that can help get out of there. Otherwise, yeah, like if you still have to fill out that questionnaire, all of the documentation, everything that you're doing as part of the ISO process is something that will help you answer those questions. Because if you're doing ISO right, you're going to have a much, much better and documented understanding of your own security posture, your own security program. You've got your statement of applicability that tells you every single security control you have and whether or not it's implemented and why it's implemented. And so that's something that you can use as you go through those questionnaires to help answer those questions definitively and quickly.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any other questions or notes in the chat. So I think that's about it. Wrapping up quarter after the hour. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us today. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you happen to pop off the webinar and have another question or think you might need some help with some stuff. Reach out. We're right here for you. So super appreciate it, everybody. Have a great day and take care.
Thanks, everyone.